Yes. Oh, powerful, powerful stuff. I mean, this is the real problem with Mayhem. They're kind of a vessel into which everyone pours their detest for the worst aspects of Norwegian black metal, or their maybe unjustifiably excited praise for the best aspects of the genre, when really Mayhem are neither. They're more of like a melting pot of all of the drama, the angst, and some of the most ambitious musical nodes of the genre as well. We kind of pour all of our different desires about this genre into this entity. And Mayhem is a product, if you will, that far transcends the individuals that have actually played in the band over the years. And that is the other element. Much like other artists that have been going for a long time, that have seen key clientele either move on, pass away, or check out, your Napalm Deaths of the world, for instance. They're sort of a vessel where artists within the genre get to, do a stint with them and stamp their own identity onto what they believe the Mayhem vision should be. I mean, Hellhammer's drumming will always be there, front and center, and driving a key element of the music along. But other musicians who have come and gone have also managed to stamp whatever particular kind of colour they want to onto the Mayhem template. And also their release schedule, for obvious practical reasons, has been sporadic. They haven't gone one way and done a Dark Throne and released the same crust-punk album every couple of years. They've had bursts of creativity and then long gaps, and sort of ridden on the coattails of Reputation, interviews from Sam Dunn, and the occasional, show at a festival or whatever. And again, this is an area where the hype and the discourse surrounding this artist far exceeds anything in relation to their actual output. But sometimes people become obsessed with the canon, the official story, the actual agreed upon narrative of who created this or that genre, who created this or that style or technique or aesthetic for a particular scene within metal. And I think this can sometimes be a little bit of an unhelpful way to look at things. And Mayhem are a classic example of this, shrouded as they are in the Greek tragedy of their demise in their original incarnation. They were at the centre of the, controversy of Norwegian black metal that we're still obsessed with today, and we can't really get away from, because the myth itself is so attractive to us that we just keep needing to retell it in different formats, in books, films, documentaries, online chat, blog posts, whatever. And this sometimes shrouds us from the actual ontology of Mayhem's music themselves, and admittedly as well, the Burzums as well, and the Emperors and the surrounding acts that orbited around Euronymous as well. But we do kind of need to set the record straight here, I believe. And I'm going to start by not talking about Mayhem, but talking about Venom. Elsewhere, I have argued that Venom did not create black metal. Now, this leads to a lot of eye-rolling, because some people will be like, well, of course they created black metal. They have an album called Black Metal. They created most of the things that Quorthon of Bathory drew upon, not just the sound, but the dress sense, the occult lyrical themes. Whilst all of that's true, when I say Mayhem aren't black metal, I don't mean it to insult them or play down their importance. I don't think Bathory or Hellhammer and Celtic Frost would exist in the guises that they did if it weren't for Venom. But I don't think it should be too controversial to say the sound of Venom was just of a different era to that of Bathory and Hellhammer. It laid the foundation, but it wasn't. It just wasn't of the same category. They were categorically different things. But people get so fixated on the idea that that's just playing it down because Mayhem are a bit silly, they're a bit camp, they are a bit unserious. So people try to accuse people like me, who don't think Mayhem are black metal, of just being a bit hoity, as if I can't bear the idea that this music that I take so seriously might have had quite a silly antecedent in Venom. I think people do tend to take it too far the other way and sort of think that what's riding on this argument is not whether Venom were black metal or not, but is the music you like a little bit silly at times, or is it imperfect, is it lineage a little bit polluted with stuff that is maybe a bit unserious? And I think that's the fundamental problem here. And I think that's the problem surrounding Mayhem. It's not just a question of is the music good or bad, it's a question of whose side are you on. Do you think Euronymous was the troubled genius that marshalled the various figures within Norwegian black metal together to create this unique form of music, and was struck down before he could fully realise that vision by the murderous Varg Vikernes, who was jealous of his standing within the scene and couldn't hack the fact that he was getting more attention? Or do you think that Euronymous was a talentless hack who exploited those around him and exploited the likes of Dead, a deeply troubled individual, and maybe somewhere down the line felt a bit guilty that he might have been complicit in his suicide in some way by encouraging his extreme behaviour? And Euronymous talked more than he walked. He was never willing to stand by what he said with actions, and the people that he surrounded him with were fundamentally more talented than him and were able to realise his vision a little bit better than him. Now, the problem with Mayhem is that both these stories are true. Euronymous was both a pivotal figure within the development of the Norwegian interpretation of black metal, and Fenris is absolutely right to say that the technique of the open string tremolo strumming that became so pivotal in the development of this style was largely developed by Euronymous. And as other people have quite rightly pointed out, you can hear it as early as 1991 on this live album. It has, Funeral Fog, and it has Freezing Moon on it as well, and you can hear the technique before Dark Throne were pushing it, Emperor Immortal, Burzum, anyone else. Yes, Euronymous was pivotal here, and the material that did wind up on this album, of course, had its own uniqueness. It was both extreme, visceral, operatic, grim. It hit many of the sweet spots as far as Norwegian black metal is concerned. But when you compare it to the fact that Burzum had at least 3 or 4 albums of similar quality, arguably superior quality, as did Dark Throne, Euronymous was more important as an organiser, an inspiration, a marshaller of these different figures. He inspired them with his endless rhetoric on what Norwegian black metal can and should be, on where death metal had gone wrong. He was able to leverage the finance of his parents into his record shop and create a hub for these people to share ideas and share music and support each other. He was able to push people and organise, but his talents weren't the same as Varg's. And Varg's weren't the same as Euronymous's. He fully understood and had an intimate knowledge of what Norwegian black metal could and should have been. Euronymous was a bit more of a scatterbrain, by all accounts. He was unable to fully realise that vision until the release of this. Now, this album, I don't want to play it down, but it arrived just too late. If this had come out in 91 or 92, it would be the pivotal moment in 90s extreme metal, let alone black metal, but it came out just that little bit too late. However, that's not to play down its qualities. As I've already mentioned, it touches on many of the strongest facets of this sound. It remains incredibly influential to this day, and Attila, God bless him, gave one of the most surreal avant-garde vocal performances I've ever witnessed on a metal album to this day. I picked this up when I was 14, 15, and I have still not heard a vocal performance as weird as this one. And that's not to say that's all the album is about, but it's odd how that is one of the elements of it that is so little imitated, because it remains truly unique and comedic in an oddly horrific way. And I find that really interesting. But the tragedy of this album is that it was released too late, so its standing remains contested. People want to question Mayhem's importance in the evolution of this music because the chronology does just not add up. And that really speaks to the importance of recorded music and getting your release out there at the right time, more than it does the importance of Mayhem itself. When as with so many artists that are central to one of the great pillars of extreme metal, who have also subsequently lost many limbs and had them replaced by other actors within the scene, Mayhem's reputation and standing within extreme metal far extends beyond the actual significance and body of their recorded output. Despite the undeniable significance, influence, and uniqueness of this album, as I mentioned, it probably came too late to make the impact that it would have done if it had been released just a few years before. But as we all know, Mayhem continued on. The quality of their work post-Euronymous, I don't think it's very controversial to say it leaves a lot to be desired. But what cannot be denied is how they were always willing to push the boundaries, to explore different sounds. No two Mayhem albums sound the same after all. How many risks they were willing to take when compared to many of their peers who either threw in the towel, got locked up in prison, or just did a dark throne and started cashing in on resentment and cheap nostalgia. For Mayhem, though, they were left with a clutch of members from their original lineup, bruised and beaten from the experiences of the Black Circle with all of their misdemeanors. They were left with one of the most unique voices within Norwegian metal in Hellhammer. He is a drummer whose style and signature is always discernible, and one of the reasons that this album is so difficult to imitate, unlike a Transylvanian Hunger, for instance. That album, for all of its class, is probably arguably responsible for black metal being the homogeneous blob that it is today. But this album, although it is oft imitated, or at least traits of it are, the combination of Hellhammer's tight precision drumming and Attila's weird-ass vocals make it a truly unique experience that is very hard to replicate, in the same way that Emperors in the Nightside Eclipse is difficult to replicate. But your Dark Thrones, and even to some extent your Burzums as well, their style was somewhat easier to kind of pick up and make a workable copy. Not of the same quality for sure, but a reasonable simulation of the experience of the originals. But the Mayhem of the late 90s and early 2000s started to veer off in unexpected directions. Obviously, Grand Declaration of War, I still hold it to be an album that warrants praise for its willingness to try new things. You have the vocals that act like they're standing on a podium declaring political manifestos. You have the weird, angular, industrial production. Again, you have Hellhammer's undeniable, unique style behind the drum kit. And you have these sharp, tinny, almost depressive guitars, but not quite depressive, because they were going for more of a powerful, esoteric kind of vibe than they were anything remotely self-indulgent or emotive. And then obviously we have Chimera, which is probably the first time Mayhem took fans' responses to heart and tried to release a direct, relatively straightforward black metal album, and again, that one is probably rather weak as a result. And then, finally, of this clutch of albums, we have this one, Order ad Chaos, which I would argue, and this is a controversial point, I am aware of this fact, I would argue that this is the most influential Mayhem album to have been released. I review 3 albums a week, I listen to a lot more albums a week, and the volume of modern extreme metal albums and EPs and artists in general that have been influenced by the weird, cosmic, swirling, murky darkness invoked on this album with its mechanistic approach to production, its weird, doomy, cathedral-esque corridors. It's more of an album that pivots on vibe and bursts of energy over linear construction of riffs and choppy, like, rhythmic punches. This album is responsible for a huge swathe of the colourings of modern extreme metal today, and many either knowingly or unknowingly try to imitate it. And again, this incarnation of Mayhem deserves praise for trying something new. Some people don't rate it, they say it's a bit flat and boring, and I have some sympathy with that view, but I would argue even if you do think that, there's no denying that the influence that it's had over the musical picture that followed is vast.
All beware the brutal assault, Lammy.
And then we come to Esoteric Warfare, which was probably another misstep in the fact that it tried to emulate many of the traits on Grand Declaration of War, but arguably failed. And then they released an album more recently, but who fucking cares? So, what is the lesson to be taken from all of this? I think it's that we want a final answer on what the legacy of Mayhem is to be, and I think they as individuals, but also the albums themselves, refuse to give us that answer. They refuse to give us closure, and I think that's one of the reasons why being a black metal fan, aside from praising the music itself, is such an endlessly engaging experience. It's that lack of closure, that lack of final word. We want to create the definitive narrative of how the genre came about, who its key players were, and how it sprouted many different kinds of iterations all over the world. But that narrative is fundamentally and necessarily messy, confusing, shrouded in mystery, shrouded in agendas of the different people involved, and shrouded in the agendas of the fans that would seek to retcon the various narratives of the events that went on. Myself included, I am just as guilty in this as anyone else. Being an arch Burzum fan has made me skeptical of Mayhem's initial influence, even though I've come to realise that it's quite silly to do it down. But also I think some people forget that just because I want to say that Euronymous was important as more of an administrator and a governor of the scene than he was a musician, it doesn't mean that I seek to play down his musical importance as well and his ability to inspire many of the key players in Norwegian black metal. And I think that's the real legacy here, and I think their post-Euronymous albums only strengthened that. But none of them were complete flat tires either. They never had their Cold Lake moment. They never had their overly ambitious Prometheus moment. They had their moments in terms of progressive and avant-garde metal, Order ad Chaos being one, but they never had that defining closure. And Euronymous never had closure on what his vision for Mayhem would be. And I think that's one of the key reasons why we find them so frustrating, and by extension the entirety of Norwegian black metal as endlessly frustrating, endlessly compelling. Come what may. Hem.